Hello and welcome to Software Huddle. I'm here with my co-host, Alex Debris. Alex, how are you?
Sean, I'm doing well. Good to see you. Good to catch up. Excited to hear what you've been up to.
Yeah, you too. So I guess we haven't really figured out what to call these episodes yet, but this is essentially our special format episode where Alex and I kind of get together, chat about recent shows, what's happening in the world of tech, things that we're interested in. And if you have any suggestions or questions for us, feel free to hit us up on Twitter at Software Huddle or, on our individual accounts, which is just our names, pretty easy to find. But maybe to start, so it's been about a month or so since we connected. At a time, you and I were both kind of setting off on international trips to speak at conferences and so on. So I think you were going to Japan. How was that trip? And how was the conference that you went to?
Japan was a lot of fun. Yeah, it was very different from anywhere I've been. I've never been into Asia or anything like that. So my wife and I went. We had a great time. We did some Osaka, Kyoto, and then Tokyo. Yeah, it was wild. Really great food and just like a fun culture and great to see some interesting things and talk to interesting people. We had a great time there.
Yeah, I love Japan. I think I talked about this last time on the when we chatted about how I attempted to move there because I
Yeah.
enjoyed it so much. But yeah, I would. It's like I like really want to get back there. I just need to kind of like figure out the either the right work opportunity to go there or maybe when my kids get a little bit older, some sort
Yep.
of family trip.
Yep. That's interesting that you wanted to move there. You being from Canada, we met a ton of Canadians that had moved there. I don't know if there's like some sort of special draw there, or if we just got the luck of the draw in sort of who we met. But yeah, there were a ton of, Canadians that had moved over to Japan there.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think a fair amount of people from Canada end up like moving abroad at some point in their life. Like
Yeah.
my sister lived in China for a period of time. Now lives in
Wow.
Ireland, so she's lived abroad for a long time. I technically live abroad, but in the United States, it's a little less different and
True.
exotic, but
Yeah.
somewhat different different than Canada though. But
Yeah.
and then how was the conference itself?
It was good. Yeah. So it was a serverless days Tokyo there, and it was nice to see that community sort of opening up and embracing serverless. And I got to meet see some people that, I worked with very early on serverless framework, and I've seen them over the years. And it was just fun to, I've only met them here in the US, and it was fun to get to see them more in their element, their own culture, talking with people they know and just getting to meet them and see that. So that was a lot of fun. It was a great energy. A few other like early serverless folks were there chatting as well. And then spoke at like an AWS loft about Dynamo and things like that. So just, it's fun to see just how they're adopting things over there, what they're picking up, what they're seeing. A lot of cool AI stuff that people were hacking on as well. So it was fun.
Is there like like from your experience there, are those like companies operating in Japan kind of at a different stage of adoption when it comes to like cloud or AI than what we're seeing, in the West?
Yeah, I was kind of surprised by that just from talking with different people and sort of culture type stuff. One thing it sounds like is different is a lot of development is done by sort of external agency consultant, like integrators type thing, like Accenture type companies there. So they were saying, I think like someone I talked to said maybe like 30% of software developers work directly for a company building their stuff, but probably 70% of them are working for basically consultants that get brought in to implement some specific project. He also said or a lot of people were saying it can be just like a conservative culture on just like, hey, this has worked. We know this sort of thing's worked. One guy was even telling me that over there, the government sort of drives innovation, or the public sector drives the private sector, where once if the public sector adopts cloud, then private sector is more like, okay, it's good enough for the government, we should start implementing it now, rather than, I'd say we'd probably think the opposite here in the United States. So a little more just kind of conservative technologically on some stuff, and very relationship driven, which I think he tends to use a lot of the same materials. So like I do a lot with Dynamo, NoSQL and stuff, and still like, relational databases are still very big here and everywhere, still, by far the dominant, but I'd say that's even more true in Japan. Like the NoSQL community was smaller and just earlier stage there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I've heard that about the Nordics as well, in terms of, a lot of the actual like engineering goes on through like agencies or like partners
Interesting.
and so
Yeah.
forth, rather than like individual companies. I also think I was talking about this yesterday at a conference I was at, and I think in some countries, I don't know about Japan specifically, but certainly in some company or countries in Europe, like also like what is considered successful is different like culturally than what you would consider success in the US. Like I think especially I feel like in the Bay Area where I live, there's success is like some like if you
Unicorn,
are a
mega
founder of a company, it's like
unicorn.
you just
Yeah.
like ridiculous bar. It's like, are you Google
Yeah.
or you failed
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times like success in other countries can be, well, I see success as like, do I build a multi-generational company that's going to last, hundreds of years and stuff like that. And it's less about like, did I go public in 6 years and have like a, $100 billion market cap or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I was surprised, speaking of just like Nordics and the EU. I don't know if you saw that chart that was like floating around on Twitter recently, but it was showing just like the size of the US tech sector and then like the EU tech sector and then like Europe without the EU. And I was just shocked at how small the EU tech sector was. Like you can like barely see it on this map. And even I think the sort of Europe outside the EU was bigger than the EU itself. It really sort of shocked me on how big that difference was.
Yeah, no, I haven't seen that. That is interesting. Yeah. I think even from Canada, it's more like, at least when I was living there, I found like it's a more conservative sort of entrepreneurship market than the United States. Like it's a lot about, how does your company make money in the first year and stuff. So yeah, and there's some like, I think good things about that, some value there certainly, but it also makes it harder to do some of these just like absolute like rocket ship big bets that like transform an industry.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. But anyway, enough about Japan. I think you went to Infobip in was it Czech Republic?
No, Croatia.
Croatia, sorry.
Yeah.
How was that?
It was awesome. I love that conference. I always highly recommend it. Croatia is like, like my new like favorite destination. Unfortunately, this time, because I had a tight turnaround, I also went to London on that trip to speak at Big Data London. So I didn't get to spend a ton of time in Croatia. I basically landed at like 3 a.m, like Sunday, and then had kind of like part of that day to chill out. And then the conference was Monday, Tuesday, and I flew out like Tuesday afternoon to go to London. So it was kind of a whirlwind trip. It was my first time at Big Data London as well, which I thought was a really good conference. At both conferences, I spoke on like generative AI and privacy, but they were both like, really well attended, got good questions, was engaging. So I really enjoyed it. We'll definitely go back to both conferences probably next year.
Nice. Yeah, I saw a ton about that Infobip one. Just like a ton of people there. It looked like some really good talks and things. Are those out that we can watch those?
Yeah, they're now on YouTube. Actually, maybe we can link that in the show notes. But yeah, they do. I just like of all the conferences, especially like developer focused conferences I've been to, I think Shift is like the best conference that I've been to in terms of, at least as a speaker. Like they just really take care of you. Like, and they set up dinners for speakers every night and bus you everywhere. Like you're just kind of like really taken care of, and
That's nice.
and you really get to know the other speakers because you're all staying at the same hotel and you're having dinner together each night and doing this, these different things. So it becomes like a, small community essentially. And once you've been there a couple of times, you know a bunch of people, and then you'll see them at other events and stuff like that. So it's fun.
Yeah. Yeah. I can't remember if we talked about this on the podcast before, but I believe your wife was going on a big trip and you were going to be alone with the kids for a while. Has that happened yet? Like, did you survive?
Yeah, I've recovered. Yeah, my wife was almost 3 weeks in Africa, in Kenya. She has worked with exotic animals for a long time. Has done a lot of work for rhino conservation. And essentially, was gifted a trip to Africa to go visit one of the conservatories that they have raised money for. So it was like a trip of a lifetime. And then I had to hold down the fort with 2 toddlers by myself for 3 weeks.
Yeah, both just dealing with wild animals. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a different type of exotic animal care. It was fun. I'm still like, sleep was certainly impacted, and I had to really be on it from a schedule perspective. But she's back now, and things are settling in. Doing some more podcasting, which is good. That relieves a little bit of pressure on my schedule. But
nice. Yeah, you had some good ones, and I'm excited about. I don't want to like leak any upcoming guests, but I'm excited about some of the people you've scheduled coming forward here. So it's going to be a good close of the year here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and speaking of podcasts, you talked to Tiger Beetle, Rockset, over the last month or so. I really enjoyed both of them, but the Rockset interview, I hadn't I knew of Rockset, but kind of just knew of it at like a high level. And actually, I really liked some of their like sort of product marketing material that they put together. Like they had this great, I still have it actually in my downloads folder. I pull it up once in a while. This great like PDF that shows all these different like example use cases of using Rockset. And it's just showing like existing architecture. Where does Rockset sort of fit into this world? And I actually used that a year ago as an inspiration for something that I did at Skyflow, where I did that for Skyflow. And then that became essentially like our like solutions by Skyflow, like kickoff stuff that we did. So I borrowed a lot of, or inspired by a lot of ideas that they did from like a product marketing perspective. But I really enjoyed sort of how in the weeds that you guys got around like, data structures for, that like, querying and stuff. And it's a lot of stuff that, I hadn't really like thought about or studied, since college. But I think that was like actually like some of my first publications that I did in college was actually in sort of like range queries and high dimensional search and stuff like that. So I ended up moving away from that, but I really enjoyed it at the time, and I think I could have gone in that direction at some point in my career. So it was fun to kind of revisit some of that stuff.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad you liked it. I love Druba and just like that whole, the product marketing team there. They do a really good job of explaining what's going on. And I think I don't know, other people let me know if you like it, but I just like to, with the databases specifically, like dig in and figure out, what's new, what's different between these sorts of things. Cause I think it's really just like about understanding when this can work for your use case. We really are kind of spoiled right now and just like all the different options we have. And it's nice to, really understand like, hey, is this a general purpose thing? Is this more specific? And if it's specific, like what's the specific thing we should use it for? So, I love that one. Tiger Beetle also, that was like a wild ride, because like Yoran and some of the things they're doing there is pretty fun. So I loved yours as well. Like that, the Twilio one on developer education. I mean, they've sort of been like the model for dev education for a long time. I think probably one of the earliest to do it well in this space. So it was fun to have someone from that team on and just talking about, what they've learned, how they approach this stuff, the Twilio Quest game and all those sorts of things. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I feel like Twilio's in some ways like being forced to maybe, I don't think they're abandoning it, but they're kind of moving away from some of that stuff to go like up market to enterprise. And I think that's like a natural thing that happens with a lot of companies as they get, to a certain size. Like Stripe's been trying to make that leap as well. And it's really hard, I think, to go from sort of like a community-led, developer-first, like product-led growth, self-serve like flow to enterprise. They're just kind of like two opposing like motions.
Just different motions, different things. Yeah.
Yeah. We even, at Google, like some of the tension I think around Google Cloud is that it feels like a different company because essentially it's like a B2B sales led motion and partner led motion, which is just very different than like where Google started. It was just like consumer, B2C. And I think anybody that was from the B2C world that moves in the cloud, they're kind of like this doesn't feel like Google anymore. And that's why they ended up bringing in like a lot of Microsoft, Oracle people, because I think the people who like grew up in Google just didn't even know how to do B2B. And so it's like a cultural clash and it's a hard jump to make.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, it's fun it's interesting to see that and just see the different changes we see in developer marketing and education as well.
Yeah. But I think like some of the stuff that you're doing on the database stuff, like I think, I think especially in like the sort of online tech world, we get so wrapped up in like JavaScript front end web world because they're kind of like easy to demo in a lot of ways. It's like more accessible than doing like a back end demo. Like, you're going to demo like your new database, you run a SQL query, like, okay, thank you. Like, why is this, more impressive than what I saw 30 years ago against an Oracle database, right? But people kind of forget sometimes that there's all these other types of like programming where like having a foundational knowledge of data structures and algorithms is like super important. And it just, I don't feel like it gets enough attention in sort of the zeitgeist a lot of times because maybe it doesn't feel sexy for some reason. Yeah,
I agree. It's like, it's hard to demo. Like you have to set up so much context and then just like, again, show the query or what, like, how do you do that? Another thing that's, I think is tough. And I've tried to ask a lot of these people about is just like, how do you get the trust from your initial customers and sort of early adopters? Because it's not like a JavaScript framework or something like that. It's like you're holding their essential data, which you don't want to lose it. You also want to corrupt it and have this giant mess of stuff. Like, how do you get trust from that? And Tiger Beetle especially is interesting because they're focused on like financial transactions specifically. They have an API built for just financial transactions. And it's like, wow, now it's like extremely high value data that you cannot screw up. Like, how can you accelerate that process to where you're starting to make money rather than, building this thing for 4 years before you can even get an initial client? So I think that's been like an interesting challenge from a lot of them, just talking through that stuff.
Yeah, we went through kind of a similar journey at Skyflow because, we're building a data privacy platform, and it's kind of hard to do like the MVP of that. Like it took 2 years of R&D to build like the initial product before you can even go to market. So it's like a kind of like a big, vision leap of faith thing. And, I think what we've had to do from like a go to market was initially land some like smaller customers, and on like really sort of more of a specific like use case and like point solution. And then from there, you build up some trust, build up some logos, some, credibility. And that allowed us to move up market into like bigger companies, bigger deals once we've kind of proven ourselves. Like you have to earn the right essentially to like sell into like the IBMs of the world. And it takes a little bit of time.
Yep. For those initial 2 years, like how big was that team? And was there a lot of like, was there funding rounds and a lot of funding money sloshing around, or was it pretty tight and like, hey, we really got to figure this out? Like, what did what those first 2 years looked like?
So they did an initial seed round, which, seed rounds now are like, I don't know, like 17 million.
15 million.
Yeah. So they had, they were well funded. And I think a big part of that is like our co-founder and CEO this is like not the first company he's founded. He was also an investor and like, executive at Salesforce and stuff. So he's like a well-known quantity in the Valley. Like he knows everybody. Like his LinkedIn network is basically LinkedIn. So like it that helps a lot, right? With kind of like being able to paint the vision and get people to buy into it. And then they did a Series A towards sort of the end of that like 2-year cycle. Okay. But they were able to basically use the seed round, and it was basically purely product and engineering. They had like no like sales and marketing other than like founder led stuff. And it was like when they raised the A round, that was when they started like trying to build up sort of like a marketing and sales motion. And then they raised a B round like later that year as we started to like step on the gas. So
I think that's so hard, that like early stage stuff where how are you sure you're building the right thing, especially if it's something that takes a long time to mature and bake like that? And then at times I've seen like if you pour too much money on early, like now a lot of that urgency is gone, especially like not by the founding team, but maybe like the sort of other folks there where it's like, hey, we have a bunch of runway, we can sort of get away with this stuff. I think like maintaining that discipline is really hard. I think you just get kind of flabby sometimes. But
yeah, I mean it is like I was talking to my old co-founder for the company that I founded a few days ago. And one of the things we were talking about was how, we did our best work when basically we had like no money or we were running out of money, because it's like, it really forces you to focus. And we did like our dumbest decision making whenever we were fresh off like a round of funding and stuff like that, because it's like, oh, well, we have like cash in the bank so we can like try some crazy stuff. And it does take like, I think a lot of discipline, and you have to have like constantly a sense of urgency. And actually so the founder CEO of Nucleus, which I had on a podcast a couple months ago, Evis Stranova, he actually just came out with this. He posted a long article in a Substack yesterday about how Nucleus is pivoting and all sort of the decision making that went into that. And it's really good. Like I sent him a message saying that we'll have to have him come back on and talk about startup pivots, because it's a really interesting. But like one of the things he was talking about was like, so they've actually generated, I think they were at like $150,000 or $250,000 of revenue after 6 months of like go to market, which is not bad for like early stage startup.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think the really hard decision making around a pivot is when things are kind of working, but it's like, is it working well enough? If it's clearly not working, then it's like, okay, well, we need to go back to the drawing board. And then if it's clearly working, it's like, okay, well, let's just like step on the gas. But when it's kind of like in that gray area, that's like when it's really hard to make a decision about, is this the right thing or not? So he goes through his like whole thought process of how they came to that decision. And, And it was like he basically wanted to share that journey so that other startup founders kind of going through that can learn from it.
That's cool. We'll have to link that in the show notes. That's a tough decision right there. So kudos to him for sharing that.
Yeah, it's really hard. So, all right, so let's kick over to some other news. So I know you wanted to talk about Nile, the serverless Postgres for the modern SaaS.
Yeah, I mean, I think this week was interesting. I mean, we're recording this on October 27th. In that there were two sort of launch announcements that I call like smart people doing interesting things. So like smart people that you knew about before, had done some interesting work before, and now they have like this new sort of ambitious startup. So one is Nile, which is a new Postgres startup. This has Gwen Shapira, who's like very big in the Kafka world. Was at I believe she was at LinkedIn and then was at Confluent for a long time and did like a ton of education there, as well as like the former VP of Eng at Confluent. So they sort of went off last year and said they were doing something new. It wasn't really clear what it was. But it's basically this managed Postgres offering, which there's a bunch of those in the market. You know, they're claiming serverless. They haven't really released pricing yet, so I don't know. Connection management, a lot of just like management type issues. But one thing that's interesting about this is there's like application level features that are helpful. And basically like it's like a tenant aware database, right? So if you're doing a B2B SaaS and you have all these different tenants, I think one worry is just like, man, are you jamming that all in one database? And if so, how do you make sure you're not sharing one tenant's data with another? Or maybe you have GDPR or other like regional requirements. How do you handle that stuff? And what they're claiming is like, hey, we built in tenant awareness at the database level. So now I believe, I haven't looked into it super closely in the technical stuff, but it looks like each tenant is like in a separate table, probably in like a separate Postgres schema altogether, and it's like totally separate. You can have them share tables if you want and things like that, but basically, they're totally separate to where you're not going to have that issue. It's sort of like insulating you from that data leakage across tenant issues. So I thought that was like very interesting in that it's not just like a scalability or operational feature, but it's actually like an application level feature that they're building in to make this easier for you.
Yeah, I thought it was pretty interesting, and I think like every time. I think like we've done everything there is to do with Postgres. There's like some new
It's
company.
true.
Like you're more well versed in the world than me, but why do you think there's so much continued innovation like in the space? Like, is there room for so many players to be successful, or do you think it's like that we're going to end up with some convergence and this is going to be a couple of like power players at some point?
That's a good question. I actually want to like write up some like how I see the Postgres space. I was thinking about this the other day, like what are the different sort of like axes you can classify companies on. And also when I talked to Sam Lambert at PlanetScale, which is like basically the MySQL version of a lot of these Postgres things, we talked about how it's interesting. There's like a bajillion Postgres startups, and then there's like one MySQL startup, and it's PlanetScale. Yeah. And I was like, why is that? And he said partly it's the community is really big around Postgres and has been good. They also have a pretty good extensions system and API under that to where you can extend Postgres pretty well. So that's why I think Timescale is like a time series database built on Postgres. And it's very easy to just sort of build that as an extension and hook into like most of what Postgres has to offer without having to sort of rebuild all the storage subsystem and all that stuff. But I mean, that's sort of true. But then you also see Postgres databases like Yugabyte, which I believe is Postgres compatible, but not using Postgres under the hood, or Neon, I think it like rewrote the Postgres storage APIs and things like that. So I don't know. Like it is kind of interesting. It's not just the extensions. It's not just the community. It's I don't know. It's something else to where we'll see that. And my assumption is we'll have to see some consolidation there. But right now, it's interesting to see those differences. And you have like the ones that are hyperscalers, like Yugabyte, maybe like Amazon Aurora, Postgres compatible, maybe Neon, something like that. But then you also have these ones that are competing on application level features like Nile, like Timescale, Supabase is in there as well. So it's just like a very interesting ecosystem right now, I think.
So you mentioned extensions. We actually at Skyflow, we built on Postgres as well as like part of our underpinnings of the Vault. And part of that is we can use the extensions to build in, we use it for, our polymorphic data encryption technology, which allows you to run like fully encrypted queries. So that wouldn't be really possible with a lot of other sort of database technologies. So I get that. That makes a lot of sense. But I think it's like hard to, like if you were a founder and you're trying to figure out like, where do I sort of what makes sense for me, or even like a new project. There's like so much stuff to try to navigate. And I guess that's true of like everything in tech at this point, but like, it's like, how do you even make that decision? And are you like shooting yourself in the foot at one point? I talked to a a CTO of a company recently he'd been at this company for like 13 years, and had essentially been there from the time that it was like a single web instance with the database running on the same server to now like this like huge like modern system with where they're doing like a combination of buying servers from like basically on-prem services to back up through auto scaling on AWS and all this sort of stuff. And they made a choice at one point to move from like a SQL database to like Mongo, and then that was like a utter failure for like what they were doing, because they were trying to do all this like analytical operation, and it turned out like, oh, we actually need like joins and
Yeah.
yeah. So then they had to migrate back essentially, and they eventually ended up like on RDS. So like you can like really hurt yourself if you make a wrong choice.
Yep. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I know it is tough in the database world, because like you do get people that just want to glom onto the hype or the excitement or what's new. And like, I think in the last 5 years, we've seen database marketing get a little better about just like, this is what we're good at and this is where we fit. Like we were talking about with Rockset, like I think it's getting better at that, and hopefully driving better decisions, but we'll make all kinds of bad decisions along the way as well.
That's one of the things I liked about the interview on Rockset as well, was he was very clear about like, hey, this is what we're good at, and if you're trying to do this other thing, we're probably not like a fit. And I think you need to kind of do that. You need to like draw a line in the sand and be like, this is who we are. And that way it's like clear what someone's like signing up for. So one of the things I really liked about the Nile article too, and I actually sent this to our CEO as like an example of like, I think well-written thought leadership, was they did a really good job of kind of like outlining like why managing and deploying like multi-tenant databases is like a really hard problem to solve, and like all the things that go into that if you're trying to take this on yourself. So it's like very clear, if you were someone who's like building a B2B SaaS company and thinking about doing this, you're like, oh man, like maybe this is like a bad idea, because like this is gonna be a huge headache for me. But based on like your sort of expertise, like can you talk a little bit maybe about the like complexity involved with like managing and isolating tenants? Have you had any experience with that?
I mean, yeah. So most of the stuff I've done is with Dynamo, and like Dynamo is going to be, you're pretty prescriptive on like how you actually have to query your data. It's not going to be very flexible for you. So it would be like fairly rare for someone to, a new dev to come in and write a SQL query that doesn't have a where clause with the tenant ID in it, and therefore like grabbing someone else's data. Like Dynamo partition keys basically help you a lot. I think people that are doing multi-tenancy on Dynamo use, probably a tenant ID or something like that in their partition key to help segment their data. But yeah, I just think the worry is like you have this, a filter that basically needs to be applied to every single query to make sure you're only filtering within a tenant, and make sure you're not commingling that way. And so you have that sort of issue. Also, if you're putting it all in the same database, like, are you providing some sort of thing where you want performance isolation from each other, right? If you have one like very heavy client, and especially if you allow like exports or something like that can be database intensive, like that, is that going to affect the other people in your database? And then sometimes people do separate database for each tenant, but now you have like a huge management issue. You have to have like a pretty high dollar value per tenant in order to make something like that feasible and worth it. And you have like a lot of low utilization databases essentially. So there's just like a lot of difficulties on like keeping your data separate, performance implications, all sorts of things that make it pretty tricky.
Yeah, they got into some of the details on some like the performance, like basically like, if one of these, one customer essentially is like exploding in usage, like what does that do to impact like your other people, the other customers, and or like blowing up of users and all this, and then of course all the like security things that you have to deal with. So I highly recommend taking a read just to kind of like understand a little bit about like the complexities of why you probably don't want to do this yourself.
Yeah.
Cool. So I one of the articles I wanted to talk about was there was this article came out earlier this month from AI Business about AI models can now selectively forget data after training. And what they're talking about, so there's this big problem around all the stuff that's happening in like the world of LLMs is that, and I think we talked a little bit about this last time, is essentially like models are designed to learn, not unlearn. So in the world of that we live in now with like GDPR and essentially the right to be forgotten, like how if you have user information that you've used to train your model with, like how can you essentially delete that information? And the challenge is like the AI models basically aren't designed to delete. Like it's a little bit like me saying like delete the part of your brain that knows what an apple is.
Forget
like,
this thing. Yeah.
yeah, like it's like
Forget this
without some
concept.
like head trauma or something like that. It's kind of hard to do.
Yeah.
So it's a big challenge around like security, privacy, copyright issues. And so Microsoft's been doing, this article talks about some of the research from Microsoft, and they were able to make Llama 2 forget its knowledge about Harry Potter through this technique, which I thought was, it kind of reminded me of the movie Yesterday, if you're familiar with that, where
no, I don't
basically
know that
the world
one.
forgets who the Beatles are, and like takes you through like what like the implications of what that would mean. And here they're just basically making the world forget, or at least this AI model forget what Harry Potter is. And the way they do it is through like a process of fine tuning. So they're trying to essentially target the distinct things that the model knows, in this case about Harry Potter, by replacing it with like more generic information. So that way, when you like do a prompt, rather than get like a really specific response, like Dumbledore dies on page X of book 6, spoiler alert, and it'll give you like a really like generic response instead. And there's now like a lot of research in this space, but essentially the limitation of the approach is that a lot of these approaches basically depend on sort of like internal knowledge of the model. Like you have to have access to like the parameters, and unless you own the model, you wouldn't necessarily have that. And also fine tuning is like really expensive, so it's not something like you could easily do and scale.
Yeah. I was kind of curious because I was looking at the examples of that, and it was good. I mean, at least theoretically, on not being able to answer the Harry Potter stuff. I wonder if it had any effect on other areas at all, or if it really was confined. If you would have asked about, I don't know, other fantasy stuff, or about England, or even if you would have asked about J.K. Rowling at all, right? Like, does it remember anything about her? Does it remember, like, she's written a few other books, right? Does it know about those, or is she just like completely wiped out of that AI's universe there? Also, they don't talk about how much training it to, like how expensive that was. And you're talking about knowing the internals, but also like how expensive is that sort of thing. It's very curious. I'll just be curious how effective that is.
I honestly, I think the like research has a long way to go before this become. I think there'll probably be like another solution essentially that becomes the more viable solution, because it's just not super realistic to me that you'd be able to do this in production. Like if you had to do this for every user that like requested deletion, besides like just the like computation cycles, but and like all the handcrafting that like really goes into it, like it'd be so expensive to actually like do this. And then there was a follow-up research from Harvard University where there's this paper they published called In Context Unlearning Language Models as Few-Shot Unlearners. And there, what they're trying to do is, instead of using fine-tuning, they're using essentially like a bunch of prompt engineering to create what they call a forget point targeting. So they're trying to like remove things through prompts to try to influence the inference cycle, but it's not 100% by any means, and it's not super easy to set up. But I think like essentially the like only viable solution right now is to make sure that you're not leaking sensitive data into a model, and you have to essentially just like put up your guardrails to prevent that from happening.
I'll be curious, like how much better how good we get at just like these incremental changes to the models, like the forgetting type stuff, but also just like incremental updating, right? Because there is this knowledge cutoff where if you have a newer API, or like, React and Next have like server actions and things like that now, which didn't exist back when when GPT-3 and 4 were created. So how are they going to like get those types of examples in there? I'd say GitHub Copilot like sort of has it figured out. Like I'll be typing in GitHub Copilot, and like sometimes I'll be like writing some prose, and it'll know things that happened in the last year. So it's just like somehow it seems like they're figuring stuff out.
Well, I think what I don't know 100% on how like under underlying structure of GitHub Copilot. JetBrains is coming out with something similar as well. It's going to be integrated into like IntelliJ. But a lot of the way that people are approaching this to have essentially more up-to-date information is they're creating like a RAG model. So they combine information retrieval with essentially the LLM. So they're going to go and take in the code example, essentially, they're going to take your code base. They probably take other examples of code, and they create, they basically vectorize it, create vector embeddings, store it in a vector database. So then when you're putting in essentially a prompt, they vectorize that, they run that against the vector database, doing a similarity search to pull back the relevant document materials, and then use that as essentially additional context to send to the LLM. And that way, like if your answer if the answer to your prompt exists within the vector store, then you're getting essentially that a better response. It also helps reduce the chance of like hallucinations, and you have like more. You basically get like more in context responses and stuff. So that's kind of like the workaround that people are doing right now, and it's also low cost compared to trying to do something like fine tuning.
Yeah, sure. Yep. Yeah, it's interesting. I'll be curious to see how this all works out. There's a lot of like unsolved problems here, even though it's definitely so integral to our workflows,
Yeah, and I'm doing a upcoming show, not to tease it too much, but with someone from Snowflake, that we're just going to be talking a little bit about like how do we like productionize this stuff, because it's really easy to build like a demo right now. Like you can basically like tie some stuff together in like a few hours or a few days and create something that like looks absolutely magical compared to what you could have did 5 years ago. But actually like moving that to production is not like that thought out, or like, like there's some like real challenges to like move that thing to like actually real users and doing it at scale.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
all right. So why don't we talk the cloud computer?
Okay. So similar, like on that same theme of smart people doing interesting things, Oxide Computer Company. This is, I believe Jesse Frizzell and Brian Cantrell are the two that started it. I can't tell if Jesse's still affiliated because he also started like a CAD company, like AutoCAD, but better, I think, in the last year. But like a couple of years ago, they're like, hey, we're building a better like on-prem like rack, basically, type thing. So, Brian Cantrell, super famous from like Sun and Joyent. And Jesse was at Docker and just like big in the container space. But they're like, hey, we're going to do this. They just came out and released it this week as well, and it's like this fully assembled rack that comes, and it's got all this fancy stuff. I don't know. Have you ever racked hardware? I've never racked hardware, so I'm not that familiar with this stuff.
No, I mean, my like closest thing would have been like in early stages of my career, like when I was in university. Back then, like your server was in a closet, but like. I was generally not on the hardware side of that, although I could, see the closet there. But and then from there, I spent time in university. By the time I was out of university doing my company, things had moved to the cloud at that point. So
I basically started on Heroku and AWS right away. So the closest I've gotten is like a Raspberry Pi. It's like interesting, and it's interesting. We've seen a lot from like, especially DHH, talking about, hey, the cloud's too expensive. You should be able to run your own stuff. And now, Oxide's saying, hey, you should be able to have a cloud-like experience to buy, not just to rent, is one thing they mentioned in their blog post. And so it's like an integrated hardware and software solution where it's this rack. It's basically fully assembled. You don't see all these cables everywhere. And also there's like a nice UI for like managing it, right? So if you want to be deploying instances or VMs or containers or whatever you want to do, it's not going to be exactly like the AWS experience, but it's some sort of thing like that to help you manage it, where you're not just like running some raw Linux instance on it and sort of managing everything on top of it. So like, I'll be curious to see if it works and like what the market is for this sort of thing. I mean, I imagine there's still a lot of use cases for that sort of thing. It's you sort of have the database problem of like making sure you're building up that trust. Like, how do you get those early customers that can trust this if it's like some very critical stuff that they're not even trusting in the cloud for whatever reason? But it'll be interesting to see. And like, I want to bet against Brian and Jesse, so it's a good team.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably part of the value that they have is like they're like somewhat famous, like proven people. So that helps with like the trust issue. But I think like my big, I don't know, like question I had from like reading the article is like who's this for? Like who's sort of like their target market? Because like if you're like a young startup, like you're probably I don't know. I like unless you have a really compelling reason, like it doesn't make a lot of sense to be like, oh, we're gonna buy our own hardware and run our own like cloud racks and stuff like that. But what they're doing in principle, I think makes a lot of sense. Of like just like, hey, let's like think about this sort of from first principles and like build the the cloud computer as they phrase it. It kind of like how we see some of the stuff in the database world of like, hey, let's build a database that's like cloud first rather than try to move something that was not designed for the cloud to the cloud. So I get sort of the like first principles way of thinking. I was just like, I'm not sure like who the market is. I'm sure there is a market, like because even I mentioned the CTO earlier that had been at the company for like 15 years and started with like a single server. And one of the things that they did to keep their public cloud costs down was eventually they do a ton of caching at sort of the edge. So they have like local, they want to do local caching. So if you're in Brazil, you want to hit like the Brazil cache essentially. And then, they might have a centralized database somewhere else. But they knew that sort of what the baseline amount of like scale they needed to serve their like baseline use case. So it was cheaper for them to essentially like rent servers from places like close to the where their users are, and then run their cache there, and then they fall back to AWS for like auto scaling when they have spikes. So if they're doing that and this was less expensive, then maybe it makes sense for them to cut costs further by essentially like actually buying the hardware and running it directly there. I don't know.
Yep. Yeah, that's interesting. And I also like, I'm not familiar with this space at all, but there's still like a bunch of like data centers and co's and things around. And I wonder what that experience is like, especially like the user experience on that. And maybe they're selling to those people and doing this. And now it's like, hey, you have this nice hardware system and a nice sort of like industry standard UI on top of that across all these different co facilities or something like that. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'll be curious to see. It's also interesting to see, like, we just had this period of, it seemed like every startup was just like a purely software B2B business type play. And like, I think people are realizing that's a competitive, non-defensible space. Cause it's just like, hey, if you can build it, like a lot of people can just build it. And it's mostly just like, sales and marketing and stuff like that at some point. Whereas like you're seeing a little bit more like looking into hard tech again, whether that's AI, whether that's, I feel like there's been an increase in like defense tech type stuff, or like who's that airplane company, the guy from Amazon, like Blake Schnell or somebody, he's like making some super fast but he's like the Concorde again, like a fast airplane type, like a passenger airplane that can be very fast.
Yeah, maybe the Concorde was like ahead of its time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like something sort of like that. And he's saying, hey, you can go from New York to Tokyo in like 2 hours or something like that.
Yeah. Well, I would think like now with a lot of the like platforms as a service, infrastructure as a service, like all these different things, it's like lowered the barrier to entry to build a lot of these like B2B SaaS products, which makes a lot of products that historically maybe were hard to build and they had kind of like a moat around them become more of like a commodity thing. So like more and more types of software become commoditized. So then it kind of ends up being like hard to have a competitive edge, or you need to like really go niche, or it's like a race to the bottom in terms of like who prices the lowest. So then that's maybe transforming the industry to some degree of people who want to really like push the envelope and be on the edge of tech to go see like what is the next like hard problems to solve. Like I'm really excited about everything that's happening in like biotech right now. Like I only spent a year like in bioinformatics formally when I was doing my postdoc, and much more on the computer science side of it. So I'm like very much stepping outside of my like depth in terms of like biology stuff. Yeah. But I just think all the stuff that's going on, like the potential of generative AI applied to biotech for like drug discovery and stuff, is just completely transformed like that world. And there's so much, like we talk about big data, but like big data is like not even a reasonable term when you're talking about biological data, because like even the like Human Genome Project back in the 90s is like probably like petabytes of data. So there's not even a way as a biologist to like wrap your head around the amount of information there. Like they can't like continue to innovate in the space, I think, without leveraging tools like AI. So if we can get things that allow them to be able to like really like, take this thing, like go from essentially like accidental discovery of drugs to something being more like a design project it's going to really change things.
Yep, for sure. And this is a great segue. Speaking of like hard tech problems and all those sorts of things, your article, you had an article on quantum communications, which I'm excited about because I know nothing about quantum computing. I didn't need you to explain it to me, but maybe like tell me about the article first, and then I'm going to ask you dumb questions.
Yeah. So speaking of dipping outside of our comfort zone, I technically have I think 3 papers published in the quantum computing world from like 15 years ago. But
yeah,
so there was this article that came out about the University of York. So they sent quantum information from Ireland to the UK, so across the Irish Sea, basically. And it actually in 2021, so that's 224 kilometers. In 2021, Toshiba sent qubits 660 kilometers, but it wasn't across like the sea, basically. So there's a bunch of stuff around this. So I reached out to a friend of mine that is an expert in quantum computing that I actually co-authored those papers with. And I didn't tell him I was going to talk about this, so I won't mention his name or anything. I'm sure someone could figure it out. But anyway, so I was like, like how like legit is this? This is like important because I feel like the 3 areas that get the most like overhyped and like blown up in the news in terms of technology is like robotics, AI, and quantum computing. Because I think they're just like these like far out like hard to understand like concepts where you get these like sensational headlines because they lead to people like clicking on the articles. But like, how like real is this? Is this an important thing? And his main feedback was, one is like, the articles don't talk about like what's the actual bit rate. So if the bit rate's really low, it's not necessarily very impressive because it's not going to necessarily have impact in terms of like really fast communications. So it's more like they're showing it's possible across these long distances, but it might not actually be like a practical thing for it. But his bigger concern is they talked about, and I read up on this a little bit too, is that there's not really like that great an application for essentially sharing quantum information like this. Like the only sort of known practical application for this is for quantum key distribution, which is essentially like if you're doing quantum encryption, like how do you do the equivalent of like a public-private key distribution. But the thing there is that you could also just use like Diffie-Hellman key exchange, which has been around for forever, which we use for like TLS and SSH and all this sort of stuff. Like there's basically a purely classical standard hardware way of doing key exchange that would work also for quantum encryption that is like much cheaper and exists today than necessarily doing quantum key exchange. So that was kind of like the main thing that I was talking about there. But I was just interested in talking about it just because I think that there has been a lot of like chatter around quantum computing the last few years. Like there was an article a couple of years ago from Google that talked about sort of the first like experiment to show that like quantum computing was able to do something that like a classical computer wasn't able to do.
And what is that like? Okay, so I am mostly out of the loop on quantum computing, other than I hear people talk about it and get excited. But like, how will it change things? Like, what's the big deal there?
Basically the idea is that so you basically have through quantum entanglement, you can essentially make like two like basically a particle, two particles that are maybe even separated by distance be sort of linked to each other. And once you measure the result of one, you essentially get the result of the other. So you can send the information potentially across that distance. The other thing is that the qubit can be in multiple states at the same time. So because it can be in multiple states at the same time, in theory, you can have a lot less like qubits to represent a massive amount of information at once. So that means that if you can do it right, then you can solve like some really hard problems like prime factorization, which is a big part of a lot of standard encryption methods for key generation. Is if you can basically solve those hard problems, then using a quantum computer, then it would break some things like standard encryption methods. So that's like, so basically, like if you just take encryption as an example, they're based on the problem of like there's this hard problem that a classical computer would take too many compute cycles to ever be able to solve, like prime factorization as an example. So, and this is the whole notion of what's known as like provably secure, which essentially means that like it's been mathematically proven to be secure because there's a provably hard problem that would require being solved in order to crack the problem. So anything like that is equivalent to like an NP hard, not a non-deterministically polynomial hard problem, is a hard problem to solve for a classical computer because we have no way of doing it fast that we know of anyway. But in the belief is that quantum computers are not a standard, essentially Turing machine. They represent a different type of computer that solves a different class of problems than a conventional computer. So you have like in the compute space, you have, basically polynomial P problems. You have NP problems, non-deterministically polynomial problems. And there's like, most people believe that they're not the same. They're basically a different set of problems. And there's like a big, reward if you could prove that NP equals P or it doesn't equal P. But most people believe that NP is different than P. And then in the quantum world, essentially, there's a belief that they can solve problems. Some essentially NP complete problems could be solved by quantum computers, but no one's actually proven that to be the case. But it's kind of generally established that it could be the case. So the class of problems that are easy to solve with a quantum computer are different than the set of problems that can be easily solved with a classical computer. So what that means is for certain types of like problems, suddenly you can solve those problems in polynomial time that you couldn't have done before.
Interesting. And then so how far out do you think quantum computers are from being usable? And will they be used like for a sort of narrow subset of problems, or will they be like driving all of our, I guess, like how do they integrate with what we're currently
it'll
doing?
be, I think, for a narrow set of problems. It'll be like for specific problems. One, like they're expensive. And like you probably, I think even if we had like quantum computers, you'd probably use like a classical computer to like interface with it. So it's not like, only the 6 richest kings in the world will, have a quantum computer or something like that. But the other thing is like they're designed. I mean they sort of solve, at least today in theory, solve like very specific problems. So it's not like you're going to be running like, I don't know, your Unreal server off of a quantum computer. Like it's just not the same thing, right? So, but I think according to my friend, I asked him about this a while back too. I think they're pretty far away from being around. There's just so much error involved with it. Like that's the big challenge is like, it's like you're dealing with things on the quantum level. So any tiny little mistake is just blown up massively. It's like if you draw a line on a sheet of paper, it can kind of look straight. But if you extrapolated that line to like from the Earth to the moon, you would see it's like very off in terms of not being straight. But that's basically what you're getting at the quantum level is like any kind of mistake is like magnified massively. Like it's like, so if you incorrectly, it's like having a hand the size of like a planet and trying to flip a quarter, like you could essentially like explode the quarter if you didn't use the right amount of like pressure to do it. So that's basically what you're doing at the quantum level. So the fault tolerance is super high, and that's where you can't really like no one's been able to use these in like outside of like sort of like research type of problems. But there has been companies that in biotech space, back to that, have been trying to experiment with using quantum computing in combination with like generative AI and stuff like that to do innovative stuff. But I think they still run into this challenge of just like the tech's just not like there. Like we're probably years away. I think we're closer to having like solved general AI where it's like equivalent to human level intelligence than we probably are to having like a quantum computer that we can use to solve like real concrete problems.
Yeah, well, maybe AGI will create us a quantum computer. Maybe
there we go. Like, well, actually, when we get the super intelligent, when we go past AGI and we get the super intelligence, then they'll figure it out for us, and they'll just like bust out the quantum computer.
Nice. Well, I'm glad I don't have to think about it too much. It's not going to change how I write stuff day to day, at least for a little while yet. So
it's nice. Probably not going to affect the next book you write or anything. All right. So, So that's the news. What's coming up next for you?
Next, so I have reInvent in a month, so that'll be
Me
the
too.
focus there. Yeah, you'll be there. Nice. It'll be good to catch up. So yeah, kind of like that. It's kind of like a nice bookend to the year. I feel like you get back from that, and people are kind of casual into the holiday season and the next year. So yeah, looking forward to that. What about you? You got any big things coming up?
So I mean, I was at a couple conferences this week, spoke on some panels. There's actually one panel that I did for that was kind of on the what does like generative AI mean for developers and stuff like that, that we might actually be turning into a podcast, because there's just like so much to talk about. We didn't have time to actually cover that much in the panel, so we might go long form version of that at some point, so people can be on the lookout for that. But I have reInvent coming up as well, and then I haven't been on basically no travel through October, and then travel towards the end of November, and then I have a couple weeks of travel where I think I'm gonna be in Paris for a conference in the 1st of December, and then New Orleans for something as well, and then kind of settle down for the holidays.
You keep a busy schedule. You're all over the place. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's good. That'll be
so
good.
that's what's coming up for me.
Nice. Well, again, I'm looking forward to some of the podcasts you have scheduled as well. I know these guests are going to be great. So, yeah, should be good.
Awesome. All right. Well, until next time, thanks everybody out there that listening to this. Again, if you have questions, suggestions, anything like that, feel free to reach out to us at Software Huddle, or you find either of us on LinkedIn and Twitter. We're there, by our names. Pretty easy.
Yeah, sounds great. Good to talk to you, Sean.
Bye.
See you.